Well, we're here with Jennifer Scappettone. Hi, Jen.
Hi.
How are you?
Great to see
Anna.
you.
Hey.
Hi. And we're here to talk about one piece of this remarkable book called Republican, it is not, The Republic of Exit 43 by Jennifer Scappettone. And its subtitle is Outtakes and Scores from an Archaeology and Pop-Up Opera of the Corporate Dump. And we are going to talk about one of the visual poems in this book. And it has a title, and the title is the initial words of this. Was no one, way went Alice. And it is quite visual. It's full of words. So Jen, can you say in the most basic way how you assembled this visual poem?
Sure. So I think of the visual poems as the parts of the pop-up opera. So each of these visual poems is imagined as a pop-up window that appears in your browser while you're trying to assemble a narrative, an informative narrative about a disaster that occurred on the internet. And these sort of beguiling, lyrically and visually seductive pieces pop into your visual field and maybe your aural field, and they are these choral pieces in my mind, and that technically means that they assemble lines from many different sources. Some of them are canonical poetic sources, like Virgil with his Georgics and their English translation by John Dryden. Hesiod's Theogony is in the book. Some of Virgil's original Latin is in the book. And then that's mixed in with different types of language. So Cinderella, a copy of Cinderella that I found on the street in Italy, and some technical sorts of texts, including a complaint page of a wire company that is responsible for having dumped tens of thousands of tons of metal hydroxide sludge into the dump across the street from my childhood home, and a Long Island breast cancer research project, which was inconclusive about the reasons for the breast cancer cluster on Long Island. The main texts, though, in the piece are two canonical texts. One is Walt Whitman's Starting from Paumanok, which is an indigenous word he used on purpose to refer to Long Island, which is where I was born, in the township in which he was born.
Was he born in Soyasset?
In the town of Oyster Bay.
Oyster Bay.
He was born more in Huntington, and so my local mall was called the Walt Whitman Mall, and I lived under the shadow of Walt Whitman and wanted to aspire to his, status. And so he always kind of loomed over me as a great writer. The other canonical text is Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures Underground, which title he changed because he said in a letter to a friend that it sounded like an instruction manual about mining. He changed it to Alice in Wonderland at that point.
I want to turn to Anna in a minute to ask her what it's like to encounter this pop-up, but I have one more question for you, Janet, for the start. So from what you've told us, in part, this is, the word autobiographical is incredibly an understatement, but and flat. But this is a personal document. Exit 43, I assume, is Long Island Expressway? That's right, okay. So this is very local. And since we're talking about toxic waste and carcinogens, and your childhood interest in Whitman because you guys were born in the same place and all this, it's personal. Yeah? Can you say a little more about, this is particularly helpful for people who are encountering this kind of experimental poetry for the first time. You think of personal poetry as more directly expressive of the self, but this is indirectly expressive, if at all. So how do we deal with that? How does self-expression come into play here?
Well, in the most personal sort of testament to how I made the poem and the book in which it's contained, I would say that I started it when my mother was battling breast cancer. And I wanted to understand the reasons for her illness. And I wanted to understand more about the process of chemotherapy, which was literally through a port administering toxins into her body.
Right.
So actually starting from Paumanok is an interesting inroads into this question because it's Whitman's poem of his birth, starting from fish-shaped Paumanok, where I was born, well-begotten and raised by a perfect mother. So I started from fish-shaped Paumanok as well. I was well-begotten and raised by a perfect mother, but my mother and I have imperfect bodies because of where we live, and it has nothing to do with being well-begotten. The landscape was not well-begotten because certain corporate interests held the day in that place. So for me, it's an oblique but still piercing indictment of the ways in which we think about inheritance and heritage, that we inherit what our mothers give us in terms of values, but we also inherit values and substances that we aren't necessarily complicit in or even aware of. So when Whitman, in starting from Paumanok, says, "I will make the poems of materials, for I think they are to be the most spiritual poems, and I will make the poems of my body and of mortality," I agree with that. And this is a sort of poem of my body and my mortality as well as my mother's, but it's also the story of all of us, because these liminal disasters, these sorts of homes that were erected in places there shouldn't have been homes, these elementary schools that were erected next to toxic waste dumps, they're actually sort of ubiquitous. They're an inherent part of what we call modernity. Modernization needed land on which to take place, and we increasingly outsource that, which is why I feel that this story is also part of a much vaster story. And so I can't tell my own autobiography without the I slipping away from me and becoming a choral poem, a we.
Damn, that was some answer to my question. Jen.
Yeah.
Anna, I mean, I know you felt this way, but I'd like to ask you about it. I mean, I was powerfully moved by this work.
Totally.
Can you help us, as someone who's just encountering the work for the first time, help us deal with, in the instance of the piece that we're talking about, how do you encounter it? How do you read it? Jen used the term choral, but of course we think of choral as having to do with sound and music. This is visual. Give us a start on how you
there's
deal
kind
with
of a chorus of voices, right? I mean, a chorus of voices that, kind of comes together to kind of together create this text. I mean, there were kind of two things that came to my mind that helped me with sort of inroad my way into this. Not knowing as much of the sort of where the texts were coming from, why they were important to you as much. I mean, you kind of need the whole book to bring that forward, but just looking at this text alone, two things I thought of. Number one was my grandmother, who always, and my mom continues this, whenever she would read something in the newspaper that she that made her think of me, she would cut it out and put it in an envelope and mail it to me.
Oh, my mom does that too.
Yeah, it is really kind of an old school thing. And my mom still does it. I'll get these like envelopes with, just like random thing in the newspaper. And it's not always clear to me what it is she wants me to read because there's like a back and a front. And then, then it becomes apparent. So I thought of that and just thinking about the way that sometimes you'll read something and you'll think, I just need to save this and I need to clip it and keep it. So, I do have this kind of wonderful archive of clippings that I then have saved because I can never throw things away.
So to radically simplify what you just said, which is what I do, that is to say, in order to ask questions.
Yeah.
It's kind of a scrapbook. It's a super smart poet, professor type who's interested in modernism and collage and these political and aesthetic issues. That would be you. Doing a scrapbook.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
you cut this stuff out from books or photocopies of books. It's very colorful, so.
Well, the other thing that I was then thinking of is Julia Kristeva's idea that we're all a tissue of citations. Mm-hmm. And that came to my mind immediately looking at the way that this is cut up and put together. And then what you said about the poem, about this being a poem of the body, made tissue then kind of resonate even more.
In a minute, I'm going to quote a few phrases from the preface, which is called an underture, as an opposite of overture, and ask both of you to respond to what's said. But before that, Anna, I just want to ask you about Whitman. So, is there something Whitmanian? We know there's something Whitmanian about the site, and there's a connection. Mm-hmm. Is there something Whitmanian about the form of this poem? And it's kind of a leading question because you've already talked about. Would you want to say something about Whitman here?
Sure. I mean, you could think about Whitman being a person who's interested in multivocality, especially in terms of New York, Long Island, Manhattan, the blab of the pave, the kind of being a figure who is drawing constantly from the world around him.
Blab of pave is perfect. I wonder if the three of us, and we didn't prepare this, you have the text, Jen, right, of this one page, this pop-up. I wonder if the three of us can just randomly invoke clipping voices from some of the phrases. I'll start and we'll go around, just so people who happen to be watching this can sense the variation. So I'll start.
Should we
Do you want to do
overlap
it?
voices?
I think we do that. Sort of
that's
just.
cool.
Is that how do you perform this? By the way, you do, don't you?
I have two really different ways of performing it. One is where I perform it, which is
Right.
more requires the knowledge and the sort of almost virtuosity of how do things connect.
Right.
And then another way is totally different, and I do it chorally, and I sort of assign. Well, usually people aren't comfortable just randomly coming in, so sometimes I'll say, why don't you do the left-hand side and you do the right-hand side, and I'll thread it together or something
Okay.
like that.
Cool.
So we're doing it a third way, which is unrehearsed choral.
Spontaneous.
Okay,
Great.
well, let's see it. I think what we're trying to do here is to generate blab of paveness that, I think of if you funnel Whitman through William Carlos Williams' idea that, he could ride around Patterson with the bus window open, just hearing voices, hey, Mac, what do you want to, that kind of thing that Williams liked so much. And we can maybe produce that kind of sound. Okay, so here we go. All right, and 1, 2, 3. Shall vex the
Caught
thrashing
unaware by-
floor.
Starting from fish-shaped
To the
promenade,
global shit list.
potential exposures.
Even if my head would.
So far
Wormy
off.
clouds over Manhattan.
Oh, to the global shit list.
Well begotten and raised by
Wormy
a perfect
clouds
mother.
over Manhattan, distinguished acres of litigious
Caught
Recycling
unaware
at its
by-
best,
well
said
begotten
Zucker.
For
and
shutting
raised by
people
a
up.
perfect
Firms
mother.
of wall.
Recycling at its best, said Zucker.
For
Not
shutting
to
people
encumber
up.
his poem
Exposed
with
to
too
beta
much
benzene
business.
hexachloride. Also,
Poor girl looked
eternal
down at her
progress,
rags and...
She
not to
vanished
encumber
there.
his poem with too much business.
Oh.
It was good. Anna, what did you hear? I mean, multivocality, obviously, but let's bring Whitman into this again.
I mean, it felt like for a second we were kind of transported to just being in a busy place and hearing snippets of conversation happening all around you, people's lives you know nothing about.
Even though, if you did what I did, which is to Google phrases, which you can do, and you could do at the time you assembled this, but there was a time in the past when a poet could do this kind of work and you couldn't archaeologize it backward. But, you know, let's take example, shall vex the thrashing floor. Well, I thought that was a very powerful phrase. I could tell by the typeface that it was an old printing. And I found it in the works of John Dryden. So this is Dryden's translation of the Georgics.
Although he has a different word, which I just learned from you before we did this. Englishing. John Dryden's Englishing.
Oh, yes, his Englishing.
Yeah.
Love that as a verb.
And, you know, and I shall vex the thrashing floor is a great poetic phrase. Do you have any idea why you chose that particular phrase?
Yes. So there's another piece in this book. And so, as you already said, you kind of have to have the whole book to really, each piece brings something out in the other pieces. So there's a piece in the book which is an essay in verse about the form of the Greek chorus. And it turns out that the chorus was born on the threshing floor where the wheat was beaten to remove the chaff.
That's the chorus.
Yeah, so that was that space, and because it was the only flattened space where dancing could occur. And I was working with dancers who were mapping these poems onto their bodies at the time in New York City, Kathy Westwater's group of dancers. So I was very much thinking about the form of the chorus, its relationship to dance, and how that gave rise to tragedy. I was also very interested in the sort of frisson between threshing and thrashing. So for me, I imagine the floor of this toxic site as thrashing with all the voices and all the toxins that are just sort of trying to get up out of the ground, and that I feel myself to be channeling through these sorts of conduits that I'm creating with the visual pieces. So it has to do with that. I have it linked with the existing data. So the existing data shall vex the thrashing floor. It shall vex the chorus. It shall vex the place for dance and making the dance into something disturbing and uneven.
The obvious thing I want to say is that the poetry I admire, I'm speaking personally now, is a piece of writing that does what it says, that in some ways the poem is enacting the thing that it's talking about in content. I mean, I'm not interested in a poem telling me something that doesn't have enough respect for what it's telling you that it doesn't do it itself. So it's so much less interesting for there to be some kind of long lyric poem that maybe starts left flush and just does the usual lyric poem thing about this toxic situation, about the state of Long Island, about the relationship to the Georgics and to Whitman. This poem thrashes, and it's about this kind of thrashing. And that's all I want to say, which is, so as an experiment in poetry, it's doing what poetry has always done. It's really not that unusual, even though it might strike people as an unusual form. It's just what, when Dickinson wrote a poem about how the mind races and goes off in its own direction, and that poem goes off in its own direction, that's doing a version of this. So there.
Yeah.
Thank you for writing a poem that is really in the history of poetics rather than being some weird something else.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I often refer to all of these poems in relation to the internet, as I've already said, I imagined them as pop-up windows. So
Right.
it was necessary to create a new form to compete with and be capacious enough to admit the internet with the vast amounts of data that assail us all the time, that in
Right.
fact make it even more difficult for us to come up with knowledge,
Yeah.
to cognize, and to turn into useful wisdom, knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's one of the places where I differ with Whitman. And I was kind of realizing this as preparing for this. I was rereading, starting from Paumanok. And in this poem, starting from Paumanok, he's trying to make the great American poem, which, and he asks, shall I scorn the antique? And so he says in the poem, I acknowledge you all, you're great, and now I dispense with you.
Right.
And
That's
this
not what
is
you're doing.
poetry about waste, and it's poetry that insists that we can dispose, but what's been disposed of will thrash. It will come up again, and this is my ethic, is to include those voices as well.
Wow.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to read some phrases, and I'm going to ask each of you to say anything you want in response to it, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts. So here's just some phrases. Some are sentences, some are phrases, and some are already obvious because we've talked about them. An archaeology of the dump, an opera of pop-ups. Edge of the township where Whitman was born. On Paumanok, punctured by numbers of a Robert Moses gasway, midway returning to the freeway of our life. EPA identified the terrain as among the most toxic in the nation. The following maps, the everywhere aborting research into the sludges, through the concurrent valves of mom's chemo and unparalleled afflictions. Along the way, I was plagued by the ethics of disentanglement and the doubt that investigative reporting might suit the business better than poesy. Well, this brings up some of the issues we've already talked about, but I wonder if each of you would respond maybe twice, just an idea, so that we can get it into the record. Anna?
There's so much there that's so amazing, and we could probably do a whole video just on that.
How about
preface.
midway returning to the freeway of our life? Heard that before?
Yeah, it's very Dante.
It's very
Very
Dante, right?
Yeah. So we think of not only Dante, but of Caroline Bergvall's Via, in multiple sort of iterations.
Bergvall getting
of that.
stuck on that
Stuck in the wood.
midwayness and never, ever getting,
Yeah.
just at the beginning of hell. You can't get, what's worse than hell is being at the edge of hell and always on your way
Always.
into hell, or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Okay. But I pointed that to you. You
Yeah,
get to
well,
pick one.
the other thing I was thinking about, and what Jen, you were saying a second ago about the pop-ups being this like sort of visual intrusion into like whatever it is you were doing is like an interruption. But what's amazing about pop-ups is that they're also always very visually alluring. And that really strikes me as like such a essential part of your project to make this particular piece also that visually alluring. Like you want to close the pop-up window immediately, but you can't because they're flashy and they have, little animations or, a headline that makes you want to click on it. And you do kind of get sucked in that moment. And sometimes it's hard to actually get out of them, right? They make you wait a certain number of seconds before you can actually close the window. You kind of have to be in there and be in that, that space. So it is, I think, an opera, and an opera of pop-ups is a really, really wonderful
also
way
a
to
great
describe.
phrase.
Yeah, it's a great phrase.
Jen, anything that I read that makes you think of another point or idea in this that you want to deal with? I mean, we hear Robert Moses for the first time in this conversation, but obviously that's important. And also the ethics of disentanglement and the doubt that investigative reporting might, you have a doubt about whether it's appropriate to this business better than poesy.
Right. So there are like two things. There are a lot, but there are two main things that I was thinking of. One is in relation to the freeway, the Robert Moses Gasway.
I guess we have to say who Robert Moses was or what he did.
He remade New York City and Long Island famously with freeways that benefited the petroleum economy and certain kinds of economic machinations, but they also destroyed neighborhoods, according to some people, like most famously Jane Jacobs.
Yeah.
The Life and Death of Great American Cities. So this is a book very much about suburbia. It's about bridge and tunnel people. It's about it's making bridges and tunnels between spaces and times. And it's insisting that those bridges and tunnels are a vital part of our metropolises, of the cosmopolitans who live in the metropolis. I would say you need to deal with the sort of underbelly and the margins of what makes those metropolises possible. Mm-hmm. So it's very much about the fact that Long Island and New Jersey, these sorts of marginal places, the Bronx, parts of the city that we're prone to dispose of as being culturally insignificant, are have materially been part of the riches of Manhattan, and I'm really interested in recuperating those spaces. So I literally grew up on a freeway exit on a street that never should have been there, and we dealt with the bad air from the freeway as well as the dump and the copper wire mill, and I think it's important to start talking about that. So people have started to talk about that in urbanism, but what is the poetics of sprawl? You know, what is the poetics that really follows the aftermath of what Robert Moses did to our cities and the car economy that we still rely on?
Mm. He did a lot. He made it possible for people who were one or two, or depending on the immigration period, 1 or 2 or 3 generations in the city, get out of the city with all kinds of incentives from the federal government as well as local. And
some
then,
people.
no, some people, but lots of people, and gave them the way to do it, and then enabled all of that to become a ruined landscape, and thought it was all good. And so many of us, I'm on the Jersey side, I just did this. It's the same story, mm-hmm. Absolutely the same mm-hmm. story. Mm-hmm. Lived about 750 feet from Route 22, and all night, every night, just listened to the rush of cars and car accidents and police cars and all that stuff. Anyway, let's do final thoughts. This is a chance for all three of us to say one more thing that we wanted to say in this conversation but didn't get a chance to yet. So, Anna, your final thought?
I just want to say something else about, can I just say the exact phrase?
Yeah.
That investigative reporting might suit the business
I'm glad
better
you're
than...
talking about that, yeah.
It really...
Yeah, that was the second thing I was going to talk about.
It really is, I think, so important and so smart and so apt for where I imagine this poem is going to fit in the ModPo Plus syllabus. Like in week 10?
With Whitman. Well, we could do it in week 10, or we could do it with Whitman.
We could do it with Whitman. We could do it either way.
But go ahead. What are you going to say?
I guess
Investigative reporting, yeah.
I guess I just want to argue that poetry, poetics, are often better suited to calling attention to a lot of, to issues of waste, issues of misuse, the politics of brownfields, as you were talking about. I think the obvious question might be, well, sure, we need an investigative journalist to go, and we need them to look at data, and we need them to look at exactly, who was the first person to, destroy this land, or, who's the first person to build an elementary school on the former site of a factory. I mean, Philadelphia deals with this. This is the story of Kensington and Fishtown, or Flint, Michigan, or wherever. And maybe poetry is actually better suited to calling attention to those things. Maybe poetry is better positioned to think about this, the tissue of citations, think about the way that this actually impacts real people and gets bodied and embodied in the body of a poet who then looks at all of these texts and comes up with the story of Exit 43.
Totally agree. Jen, final thought?
Yeah, I guess I would just add to that this is a question that plagues me, and being not from a lettered family, especially this being a book that was important for me to write for my family, has been a very interesting exercise in how to create poetry that is accessible and yet true to my experience of what it's like to be aftermath. Which, I had a friend say, oh, this should be an NPR show. And I feel badly that I don't write shows for NPR, accessible podcasts for NPR. But there's a certain way in which I think fundamentally I needed the affective experience, the sort of the feeling of confusion and of betrayal of justice to come through in these poems. And the way I know how to do that is through poetry. I was also looking to poets like Virgil who tell us about the seasons, who tell us about agriculture, whose works are almost manuals for agriculture and meteorology, and yet can also tell of myth and can make people feel in ways that they feel they need to change their lives. So that is what ultimately I want to do, and I know that if I had written a newspaper article, it wouldn't have affected my mother or my family in the same way. It's sort of, there is like a kind of confusion, but also a sort of awe of, wow, it's a really monumental problem. And that's how I want it to be experienced, not as something that we move on to the next news cycle because we have figured it out and it's over.
It's not simply the temporality of the news business, which speeds up constantly, but also the single register, the single vocabulary, tone of voice, pseudo-objectivity. You can't put your mother in a lead story in the New York Times, even if it's about the toxic waste dump. You would identify Mrs. So-and-so, and you might say this reporter, I don't know, there's so many rules about
It'd be
keeping
like
out
editor's note.
Yeah, I mean, so the genre is very strict, even though some investigative reporting is fantastic. It just passes by in a way. So the three of us are not going to disagree about that doubt that you talk about in the preface. But there are people who will. Well, what they ought to do is read the newspaper article about toxicity, and then they should read this book, and sort of hang out in both places. My final thought has to do with, right in the middle, about 2/3 of the way down, there's this one little snip, on behalf of a silent world of which we have become the agents, and the relationship between silence and our own complicity, which would seem kind of weird. I went digging, and of course I found Levi-Strauss, and I just thought I would end by quoting the passage that ends with that phrase, on behalf of a silent world of which we have become the agents. Is it the agents? Yes. He's referring to our subjective awareness of a progressive welding together of humanity and the physical universe, whose great deterministic laws, instead of remaining remote and awe-inspiring, now use thought itself as an intermediary medium and are colonizing us. Okay, so what's colonizing us in the grammar of this thing? The welding together of humanity and the physical universe that creates laws which use thought to colonize us on behalf of a silent world of which we have become the agents. That's like triply complex. And
Well, it's Levi-Strauss.
it's so Levi-Strauss, but it's also Kafka and Scappettone and all kinds of people who are warning us that traditional readings of subjectivity are really not relevant to what's happening here, to the landscape. And that's why Walt Whitman might be relevant, because this was a person whose poetry was often about the way in which the body and the identity was somehow merged with the particular landscape that he cared about and came from. Jen, thank you so much for this. This was really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for your readings.
Oh, it was great. And Anna, thank you.
Thanks, Al.